Welcome to the Criterion Chat, a podcast dedicated to discussing those titles chosen by the Criterion Collection for preservation. I'm Nate Myers, joined by Matt Peterson, as we discuss Ishiro Honda's allegorical monster movie, Godzilla. As the Pacific Ocean was used for nuclear bomb testing and Japan emerged from the devastation of World War II, the atomic age gave birth to one of cinema's most iconic characters, Godzilla, or Gojira, for closer pronunciation of the Japanese name. Released in 1954 on the heels of the Lucky Dragon No. 5 H-bomb incident, Godzilla was the most expensive movie ever made in Japan up to that time, and wowed audiences with its special effects and social relevance. The story of a prehistoric dinosaur awakening from his slumber due to H-bomb testing is treated somberly as the human characters try to make sense of an unstoppable, unreasoning force that threatens the very nature of the world. Professor Kyoichiro Yamane, played by acclaimed actor Takashi Shimura, wants to study the creature, while the civil and military authorities want to destroy it. As Godzilla destroys villages and cities, the professor's daughter, Emiko, enacted by Momoko Kochi, is torn between her love for Hideo Ogata, a young Akita Takarada in one of his earliest roles, and her arranged engagement to Dr. Zirazawa, the scientist played by Akihiko Hirata, that has created a device that can destroy Godzilla, but may also destroy the world too. Director Ishiro Honda tends to the human elements of the story with great attention, but never forgets the special effects are the real star of the movie. Special effects director Eiji Tsusubara recreates Tokyo and introduced the world to Suitamation as his giant monster wreaks havoc and towers above all. The original Japanese version of the film received renewed attention in 2004 during its 50th anniversary re-release, and is presented by the Criterion Collection along with its 1956 Americanized version, Godzilla, King of the Monsters. Released on DVD and Blu-ray in 2012, as well as again in 2019 as part of the Godzilla, the Showa-era films collection, the movie that launched nearly 60 years' worth of sequels, spin-offs, and rip-offs comes roaring into high definition with a long list of supplements. Join Matt and me as we offer tribute to the King of Monsters. So, Matt, I think both of us are eager to have this conversation here tonight about Godzilla and talk about this movie. I'm just thinking of the only time I think we've ever talked about the character, the story, the movies of Godzilla has probably been when we've talked about the Roland Emmerich American version that came out in the late 1990s. But this is a huge character, huge movie franchise, maybe one of the biggest in the history of cinema, if not the biggest. Certainly it's lasted a long time. I mean, it's longer, older, and more films than James Bond even, right? So it's a huge...
I think it is the longest running at the moment, yeah.
I can't think of anything that's gone as long as this has, and really has kind of been universally embraced, right? There's obviously a Japanese component here that's very strong at the heart of this franchise, but it's also been picked up and really latched onto here in America. Various European markets have really accepted this character and this story and these movies. So it's kind of a fascinating part of cinema history. And I thought that might be a great place for us to start with our conversation here, is just the idea of the monster movie genre and Godzilla as a part of it, and just this sense of monster movies that were huge, especially in the 1950s, and this became one of the most iconic installments in that genre. So maybe just starting off there, what are your thoughts about just the monster movie genre in general and Godzilla in particular?
Yeah, I've always been kind of mixed on the genre, I guess. I'm a big fan of science fiction, as you know, but this is a genre that I've never gotten into all that much. I've seen a handful of Godzilla films over the years. Unfortunately, I've seen the Roland Emmerich version, the Gareth Edwards version from a few years ago. I also saw that. I haven't seen the most recent sequel to that that remake.
It was kind of a fun one. I enjoyed it. It wasn't anything special, but the Godzilla King of the Monsters in like 2018 or whatever that was pretty fun.
Yeah. Yeah, I do want to see it because I did enjoy the Gareth Edwards version. And, you know, this is clearly the film that got that ball rolling, right? And there's varying levels of quality throughout that genre. It feels very exploitative at times. At other times, it's taken very seriously and used as a vehicle for metaphor. And this original Godzilla very much is in that vein. This is actually my first time seeing the original Japanese Godzilla. I'm ashamed to say that. And then I realized that this version really wasn't available in the U.S. until 2004, which is pretty amazing, actually. I had seen the Americanized version with Raymond Burr, Godzilla King of the Monsters, which was released in 1956. I'd seen that before. It's been many years. But I remember that being quite awkward at the time. Even seeing it many years ago, before I was more seriously into film, you could tell that there were quite a few scenes that were just awkwardly inserted into that version of the film. But, you know, it's a genre that when I do actually sit down and watch a film, a monster film, it does make me want to dive deeper into this whole world, especially Godzilla. Criterion, of course, as you said, released that box set recently, and it has piqued my curiosity to check that out and really go through the films in order to kind of see the progression of how it starts as a more allegorical and more meditative examination of the nuclear or atomic age, and we can get into that in more detail, I'm sure, and how it evolves into something that's more oriented toward the action or toward the visual effects or even toward comedy at some points. And it seems to be pivoting back now toward more of a serious examination of social issues or political issues. Shin Godzilla, which is the most recent Japanese incarnation of this character, was released a few years ago, and I haven't seen that one yet. I really want to. And that was directed by Hideki Anno, if I remember his name correctly, who did Neon Genesis Evangelion, which is a very popular anime series. And it sounds like he brought that lens to the Godzilla character. And whereas this film looks at, again, the atomic age and the effects of the nuclear bombings of Japan, the most recent version is an examination of Japan's response to the Tohoku earthquake and tsunami of 2011. So it's interesting to me that you can take this genre of the monster movie and really satisfy the people that are looking for action or looking for the visual effects fix that these films can provide. But they can also do what great science fiction does and force us to look at social or political issues through a different lens. How about you, Nate? I don't know what your experience is with Godzilla.
Well, my experience with Godzilla goes all the way back to childhood. My experience with monster movies goes back to childhood as well. I used to watch them a lot on just old cheap VHS tapes and on some different local broadcast stations that had access to these older films. Obviously, the kind of the American context of the monster film probably really is framed by King Kong from 1933, which I think is an excellent film. I highly recommend that movie. I really think that's an incredible work of art. And then you see how that influenced a whole generation of people afterwards. Obviously the most famous person of the bunch being Ray Harryhausen, who then went on to do all this pioneering work in special effects, starting in the 1950s especially, right? And I kind of see the monster movie genre as being uniquely well suited to the 1950s. Now, obviously, it's continued on since then, But there's a part of it that says we don't have quite the same socio-political context anymore to make them resonate. The idea of a monster, right? The word itself is, if we go back to its original meaning, is about a warning, right? From the Latin. And so monster movies, to me, always work better when they have a sort of kind of foreboding, warning sense to them. They're not just thrills. They're not just science fiction. They're not just horror. They're kind of a mixture of all those things. And there is a kind of urgency or a kind of polemic, perhaps even, at work in them. And the 1950s, with the looming threat of nuclear annihilation, right? The real kind of kicking off of the Cold War, and then into the 1960s, seemed like just the perfect powder keg for this kind of genre to explode and take off and do sort of interesting, fun things. That being all said, I don't know that I've ever really been a huge fan of the Godzilla franchise. I've seen tons of the movies. I have not seen all the movies. I don't know if I know anybody who's seen all the movies because they just are so many of them. And I know the really hardcore Godzilla fans have their different ideas about, what's official, what's not, and, this studio versus that. This is obviously coming from Toho, which was famous for the work with Akira Kurosawa, right? And a lot of cinephiles will talk about that. So, I mean, this is obviously an important movie and an important franchise, but I've never really thought that it was a high-quality one. At the same time, I can't think of a single Godzilla movie I've watched and not liked. Even, I'll be honest with you and say, the 1998 Roland Emmerich movie, which is really completely disassociated from anything that has to do with this film or the mini sequels it spawned, I kind of still liked it, even though I could tell it's absolute schlock, right? There's something about this franchise that I find always enjoyable to see, even though I don't actually think these are probably good movies. And I know that, obviously, we, as you mentioned, Matt, we'd have grown up with the 1956 version of it, and seeing that versus this version from 1954. But they're not as different as some people, I think, like to make them out to be. I think the Americanized version still has a lot of the same themes, plays very similarly, and actually, I know we can delve into that a little deeper, just about the nature of the Americanizing of a foreign film. But they did a kind of interesting perspective of how to release a foreign film in the American market and make it quite successful. But I think that this movie, I think it works pretty well for a B movie, but it's not the masterpiece, the lost masterpiece that I think a lot of people try to claim it is. Actually, the reason why I picked it for our podcast is I was reading an article by a political commentator who said he just watched the Japanese version for the first time, and that he was amazed at how great it was and how meaningful and deep and profound and all these different things. And I thought to myself, I don't know if I'm watching the same movie, because it strikes me as being pretty simplistic in many ways, but I know that I'm also in the minority opinion on that. So I guess I'd be interested to hear what is your take, Matt, on this movie as a commentary on nuclear threat?
I think it's pretty effective. I really was struck by this film's tone. I mean, it really has a solemn tone to it, a very emotional tone, and context is king. I think when it comes to this film, you really have to understand the time it was made, where Japan was during this period. This is only 9 years after the end of World War II, and there's certainly angst about the impending nuclear age, and I think the shadow of the Cold War was starting to loom large.
Even though the World War had ended about a decade earlier, American occupation had been there for a long time. So there's also a lot of high censorship of things like Nagasaki, Hiroshima that had been there.
Yeah.
People weren't really free to talk about it or process it in any real way.
Yeah, so this is, I think, a means to do that, of course, and as you mentioned, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, of course, those are the main inciting events, I think, when it comes to what inspired this film. But I also look at this film through the lens of World War II as a whole, especially the imagery of Tokyo burning and Godzilla rampaging through, Ginza, the shopping district, and through these very famous areas in Tokyo. Of course, the Tokyo endured the worst single bombing event in the history of war. And a lot of people don't really remember this, but in March 1945, Tokyo was firebombed, and about 100,000 civilians were killed or died during that one attack. So these are events that the audience at that time, these are events that are still very fresh in their minds, right? And even though not many people may have experienced the nuclear attacks directly, they would have seen the fire bombings. They would have seen the other air raids that took place throughout the end of World War II. So this is a fresh wound for the Japanese, and I can only imagine, the trauma of experiencing that firsthand, but then also seeing this film, and I'm sure that brought back a lot of that imagery as well. And I think, the film had a pretty mixed reception in Japan. Some people were writing it off as silly, that there's no monsters like this, that they don't exist, and this is just kind of disposable entertainment. But there also seemed to be, I think, a recoil culturally, because this film really did hit a nerve, and I think still does today.
Well, I think people at the time, critics especially, if you read some of the reviews from the era, saw it as also exploitative, right? You have this national tragedy that here, hey, let's put it to the thrills and shocks of a movie. And I think people saw, you think about 9/11, if you'd done something like this right after 9/11, people might have had a similar kind of recoiling that you saw from the critics at that time.
And that's understandable, but I don't get the sense that the film is trying to be exploitative or is exploitative in a distasteful way. It seems very respectful to me that it's using this mechanism of the Godzilla monster as a means to explore this trauma, but also, as you said, as a warning to those that will come after, to avoid situations like this and to avoid science unchecked, so to speak. The ending in particular is quite understated. I mean, you don't see Godzilla until well into the film. And of course, there are limitations to the visual effects at the time, and the fact that, they can probably only show so much of the monster because they just don't have the resources to show him too often. But the ending is not this grand action sequence. It's this very solemn, almost requiem at the end of the film, and that really struck me. And I think that is basically unchanged in the American version too, but it's been many years again since I've seen that other version, so it really hit me pretty hard this time, just how seriously this film seems to be taking its subject matter. And I really respect it for that.
I would agree with you. It is obviously, I think, very somber, sober-minded in its filmmaking. Earnest would probably be a good way of describing it. It's taking, obviously, a genre, which is what sci-fi can do, and I think what the monster movie genre can do, which is that you take this kind of fantastical genre, which is so larger than life and unrelatable in a certain sense, that then you can actually speak to something that's very direct and acute in a person's life in a way that they've been a little disarmed, right? Because if you just wanted to make a movie about an H-bomb going off in Japan, or about obviously this was connected, as I mentioned in the opening, to the Lucky Dragon number 5 incident, where there had been a H-bomb test, and then the radioactive ash fell upon it and made all the men sick and have actually killed one of them. So you can see how if you just done it directly, that might have been too intense for people to take. Creating this other genre allows you to speak some truths that people might otherwise not be able to hear, that people might not, that producers, companies might shy away from. You can get a lot accomplished that way. And I don't think it's exploitative by any stretch of the imagination. I don't know that I would agree with you that it was subdued. However, like if you look at that ending, it's pretty on the nose and pretty blatant. Yes, there's the very somber music and there's this kind of melancholy that exists. But you also have this very clear, almost direct address to the camera saying H-bomb testing is really, really bad. So I think where this movie where it falls apart for me is that the subtext idea is always, I think, great in these kinds of movies. So there's a subtext about the Cold War, about, hey, this is what happened to us in World War II. This is a kind of an outcry about nuclear testing, whatever it might be. Subtext, great. Allegory, perfectly fine with it, right? When you get to like the absolute blatant, not subtext, but actual text, that's where I go, not as impressed, right? Because I think that tells me that the director, the writer, the crew don't respect their audience enough to figure some of this stuff out, right? If you're going to make kind of an appeal to the camera like that at the end of a film like this, it just kind of makes me feel like you're insulting me, condescending. And I think that's part of why I don't think this movie works. There's other things about it. I will be honest with you. I don't think it's a well-made movie. I think Honda, who I know went on and did a lot of work with Kurosawa, especially late in Kurosawa's career, I don't think he really had it together to make a great movie here. And I've watched this movie in the Japanese version a few times over the past decade or so, and I just kind of keep scratching my head going, I don't know why everybody acts like this is such a great film. I don't think it is, because it has sort of a, yes, I get you have great themes, great ideas you're trying to say, but I don't know that you have the talent to say them well. And you can see it in different things, like even the costume design. You would take the character of Serizawa as the scientist. I mean, the eye patch, his lab coat, the black gloves he's wearing as he has this oxygen destroyer device. It's all so comically bad. You go like, well, that's just really bad costume design. I mean, it's laughable, right? I can't take this seriously. You know, if you want to have him be actually the victim of a war wound, you got to make it look somewhat realistic here. You got to have something that makes me think it's not a guy who you threw on an eye patch and said, hey, he got a war injury. It looks cheap in many ways. And I don't say that just because obviously these special effects don't hold up, 60 years removed nearly. But even by their own standards of the time, these weren't really all that great of special effects. I think there's a lot of retroactive reviewing of this Japanese version of it, the original version of it, that I think people are giving it passes it doesn't deserve in terms of some of the filmmaking.
When I say the ending is subdued, I mean it isn't this grand action sequence, right, with triumphant music and over the top,
well, that's true.
Kind of spectacle. But you're right to say that the whole speech that Takashi Shimura gives at the end is unnecessary. I kind of chalk that up to when this film was made, though. I do think a lot of films coming out of this period weren't exactly known for their subtlety when it comes to some of the messaging. But yeah, sure, it could be seen as a slight toward the audience.
Well, I think American science fiction was. I mean, if you look at something like Invasion of the Body Snatchers, that's a subtle film about its allegorical nature.
I'm not saying other films didn't do it subtly, but I don't see the 50s in general as a great bounty of subtle storytelling, I guess. Most films of that era are going to be very direct, hitting you over the head with their messages, and not terribly interested in creating a nuanced experience. And I think this falls into that. So it's hard for me to get too upset about that. I mean, I understand what you're saying there. In terms of the direction, or I guess I'll go back to the visual effects first. Yeah, they look pretty rough, right? I mean, these are miniatures, obviously. It's a man in a rubber suit stomping on models. It's very clearly that. And there may be a bit of nostalgia involved there, or a bit of a pass that people give it because it's of its era, right?
Well, I think it's of its era, but it's also, there's another part to it as well. Americans have always, I think, aimed for a real sense of creating realism in their special effects. Almost the way you measure a good special effect is you can't tell it's a good special effect, right? It's kind of an American way of thinking about it. That's not necessarily a Japanese way of seeing things, right? I mean, the theater, the costuming, the makeup of Japanese visual art is very stylized. And so I don't know that they would have the same instinct of let's try to make this as realistically looking as possible. You want it to seem plausible, but having Godzilla as a man in a suit wouldn't necessarily, I think, be as problematic to a Japanese audience as it might to an American audience, where you go, well, that's obviously a guy in a suit, because they wouldn't be worried about it. They'd be like, well, yeah, but it's kind of doing a sort of a sumo style, which the actor did, right? The actor who played Godzilla did sort of a sumo style posturing, which then kind of resonates with certain ideas of the sumo. And then you have also this sense of, okay, it's kabuki theater, right? You have this sense of how you are making the film or making the special effects be a little more kind of obvious, but nobody would really fault that as being a failure of special effects in a Japanese context. In an American context, we would say, no, you want to hide that there's something fake there. Japanese would embrace the fact that it's this stylized kind of filmmaking. So I think there's a cultural difference at work here too.
Yeah, it could be. I guess I don't see them as trying to make this stylized. I get the sense they were trying to make it realistic. I mean, the models and the miniatures are pretty meticulously crafted and quite accurate to the buildings of the time.
Sure, but they're also obviously models. I think the point would be they would want the audience to know that those are models, right? They wouldn't. An American would almost like want.
Well, there's no other way they could really do it, Right. But I see what you're saying, but and maybe later Godzilla films you could see as being more stylized. The little bits I've seen from Shin Godzilla, which I mentioned, does seem to have some of that, where there's some real stylized elements to it, and that some of the visual effects are not necessarily as realistic looking as they could be, and that could be a budgetary limitation for that film as well. Hard to say, but I mean, I'm glad you mentioned Harryhausen and King Kong earlier, because those are examples of where I think the visual effects are, especially in the case of King Kong, one could say that those visual effects hold up better than these do, especially when you're considering the context or the era in which that was made in the 1930s. But it's tough. I mean, I think people do have a romantic notion of the character of Godzilla, especially the original Godzilla film. And there may be some level of fascination in America in particular, given the fact that this original Japanese version was unavailable for so long. So it might be a bit in vogue to sing its praises, especially since it was something that was buried for all those years. But I think you're probably being a little hard on it here. Honda's direction is a bit scattershot, especially with the action sequences. There's really very little geography or progression to what's being presented, right? It's just kind of random shots of destruction, and we may get some unity with what's happening with the characters. That little moment on the tower with the press, for instance, it comes to mind, where Godzilla attacks that tower and knocks it over. But that's one of the few times that it seems like the destruction is directly impacting the characters on screen. In general, it's just, well, Godzilla shows up, smashes a bunch of things, and goes back into the ocean, sort of thing. And that may be a failure of the writing or a failure of the direction to not make what's happening with the monster more of a direct connection with our main characters. But I also think that this film is occupied with the political and military response to tragedy, right? So it's not just an allegory for the nuclear age or the atomic bombings of the end of World War II. or even World War II itself, I think it's also making a comment on the wheels of bureaucracy. And there's a lot of board meetings that take place, or a lot of sit downs and discussions. And I think those scenes are not wasted. I think they're trying to make a comment on how powerless our government, systems can be when they're faced with a certain level of threat. And ultimately, it comes down to the willingness of an individual to really help overcome the challenges that society as a whole may face. So that's one thing I pull out of this that I appreciated as well. And I keep bringing up Shin Godzilla, even though I haven't seen the film. My understanding is that film does that very much as well. A lot of complaints I've heard about that newest version is that there isn't a lot of Godzilla action. It's a lot of boardrooms. It's a lot of committees talking about what to do about Godzilla. And again, I think that was meant as a response to the earthquake and tsunami. There was wide criticism that the Japanese government responded too slowly to that crisis. So there's a political commentary here too that I think sometimes gets overlooked.
Oh, I definitely would agree with you on that. So there are elements to it where you go, okay, naturally this is where I think Honda's talents as a director lie more than others, right? I don't think he's probably really well adept at directing action, and the lack of geography, the lack of clear sense of, as you said, the actors being connected to this is probably a reflection of that, right? You don't really get the sense that matters. Now, some people I've heard try to argue, well, yeah, but that just shows that Godzilla is this kind of force, and it doesn't really matter who you are, and we're all kind of powerless against him. And maybe that was some element of a thought there, but I think that you're right that the film does have a lot of commentary about bureaucracy, about governmental response. But again, I think still that's a lot of that's dealing with the H-bomb testing that was taking place in the Pacific Ocean at that time, because that was the kind of stuff that the Japanese government was debating. Do we say anything about what's happening and the fact that it would connect with the Americans, or do we hide it? And that was sort of the same debate that's taking place in this movie about Godzilla, right? So I do think it's very much political commentary of that time, but there is a way in which it does speak to something that seems to go over and over and over again. I mean, we can look at where we are right now with the coronavirus and say, okay, how often are these kinds of meetings taking place in governmental offices, in business offices, where people are trying to figure out what do we decide to say, when do we decide to say it, how do we decide to say it in the face of something like a virus? And so I think that's a truth that it does tap into. I'm just not convinced that it does it very well. Where I think the movie is at its best is in its earliest part, right? The first minutes where it does kind of have the same instinct that obviously later on is done with great success by Spielberg in Jaws, where you don't show the monster right away, right? You have the initial village that you see this something going on in the sea, you see these lights and stuff, but you don't really see what happens to these boats. Something happens to them. Then you go to this village, and it looks like there's maybe a typhoon coming, but there's something else by the sound design, by a kind of a thundering, stomping kind of sound, right? But we don't see the monster right away, and then eventually we do see it. Now, it's a fairly short movie, so it's probably only about maybe 20 minutes into the movie before you see Godzilla. But it does have that instinct of reveal things a little bit. And so that is to Honda's credit, because obviously monster movies of this time threw them out there as quickly as possible and as gloriously as possible for an audience to see the special effect. And this film did go differently on that, and I think that is to his credit. But I then look at how he's trying to balance the themes, and it just strikes me as you've got the ideas there. I just don't know that you have the necessary chops to be able to bring it. And I'm going to defend 1950s cinema a little bit here. I think it's better than you're giving it credit for. I think there is more subtlety in films of that era than what we maybe find here. I think it was obviously not quite as developed as what you'd find a little bit later, but I think that you had, out of different elements of Europe. If you look at Rossellini, if you look at some of those people, you had a lot of ambiguities being strewn in there, and a lot of wondering, what does this mean? What does that mean? And if you look at someone like Elia Kazan working in the United States, he had subtlety in his work. So there was some over-the-top, in-your-face stuff. There always is, right? Every generation has its Oliver Stone. But I think that there was more subtlety and more sophistication in that era than a lot of people give it credit for. And this movie, as a guy, maybe monster movies, you don't need it. But I think this movie would benefit from more subtlety.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the subtlety of the 1950s comes out of a desire to rebuke McCarthyism, and that,
or even some of the censors, right? I mean, you look at A Streetcar Named Desire. You had to be subtle, and the censors were kind of driving some of that subtlety.
Sure, so there's some of that there, but on the whole, it's pretty straightforward, I guess. But I understand what you're saying. When it comes to this film, I think, I do think Honda's ambition, he's probably biting off more than he can chew, right? And but again, I admire the ambition here. I admire the intent. I admire their willingness to try to say something impactful through a guy in a big rubber suit. That's a kind of a bonkers idea on its surface, and I think it's largely successful. Is this a great masterpiece? I think that's probably a stretch, but I felt it was pretty impactful on the whole, and this has stiff competition. I mean, this came out of Toho, of course, the same year as Kurosawa's Seven Samurai. So Toho had a couple big hits on their hands here, and I don't think anyone would have anticipated that this would have spawned 33 plus films and decades of reincarnations. So it's interesting. Having just on a personal level, having been to Japan, Godzilla's everywhere. In Tokyo, it's like it is a fixture of Japanese pop culture, and I think it always will be. And it has really transcended its original intent as a harbinger of doom for the nuclear era, and it's become
like a teddy bear,
as you said. Well. Yeah,
I mean, in some of the movies, he is almost like that, right? He's almost like a cuddly bear.
There are different incarnations. Yeah, there are different incarnations, and his image has been cheapened and made comedic at times, and there's been an ebb and flow, I think, to the history of Godzilla. It seems to be back into its original tone in many ways. That this is a symbol, as you put it, a warning. To avoid the kind of quagmire that we can create for ourselves. So it's a character that really continues to endure. And it's interesting to ask the question, why? I guess maybe that's something I'll throw back to you. I mean, why do you think this character has lasted so long? Why do you think this monster is so successful? As you said, even outside of Japan. And it has to be more than just, it's a monster movie and monster movies are popular. I mean, monster movies are a dime a dozen, and it seems like American studios every so often are trying to create a new monster franchise, and they typically fall flat and don't connect with audiences. I mean, what is it about Godzilla that has just endured for all these years? I mean, it's really hard to put your finger on it.
Well, I think it is the fact that the character is so different than a King Kong. King Kong almost becomes very much, let's put it this way. I've called Godzilla a character. In a certain sense, he isn't a character, right? King Kong has a personality. He obviously falls in love, and then, beauty kills the beast kind of thing. This is not a character that has emotions, that has any sort of agenda or anything like that. So you can map onto Godzilla almost any thought you have. And so if you want to do something like with the nuclear reactor from 2011 with Japan, you can tie it into that and still kind of connect in. Or if you want to do the Gareth Edwards version, had really kind of just a sense of like nature fighting back against, an overly too heavy of a footprint from humanity almost thing, right? So you can map onto it a number of different ideas, thoughts, concepts that allow it to keep enduring, because Godzilla isn't really anything per se. I mean, he's just as a force of nature, and nature will always be there. And so I think that's why this one can endure so well and be around in a comedic way, in a serious way, and it just has a way of connecting with it. But I think the big part of the success of this character, Matt, really comes down to the fact that there was the Americanized version. I know you mentioned you haven't seen that one for a while. I watched it as part of anticipation of our talking here tonight. And I think the 1956 Americanized version is actually better than some people give it credit for. People talk about it as being a terrible dubbing. They talk about it as having Raymond Burr sort of shoehorned in there. And I think I've even heard people talk about, oh gosh, the editing with him and it doesn't make any sense. There's a couple spots where you could definitely tell, knowing especially that they reinserted that in there, wasn't part of the original movie, that it seems a little like, yeah, it sticks out. But for the most part, actually, he does blend in fairly well into how they've edited the movie. But they don't re-edit the whole film. They don't take out all the Japanese dialogue. They still actually have a good amount that's left in Japanese, particularly in the first part of the film. So I think that Americanized version is what really helped it to connect, because American audiences did pick up on it. American critics seemed to actually appreciate it more than Japanese critics did in the 50s. And I think what I like is I watched the Americanized version. While it does omit some of the explicit mention, people talk about, the U.S. took out any sort of reference to America, took out any reference to the H-bomb, things like that. It didn't take away the subtext of the nuclear age. It didn't take away the subtext of World War II. It didn't take away the subtext of Japanese and American relations. It took away the explicit, blatant talking about it, and I think it improved it and made it kind of more interesting as a result by having that more explicit portion of it removed and then having this just be around. The only thing I would say I really found really powerful in this film that should have been, I think, kept in the American version but was cut out is during the destruction of Tokyo, when you have the family, the mom and her children, and the camera zooms in on them and says, "Don't worry, we'll be with Daddy soon." You obviously get the sense this is a war widow, right? That was removed from the American version. I remember noticing that when I watched it just now. But I think overall, the Americanized version is a big part of why this thing caught on and why the sequels happened. Because it wasn't right away that they started cranking out sequels in Japan.
You're right. I think the American version actually made more money in the U.S. than the Japanese version did in Japan. On a
separate note, it totally changed. Joseph E. Levine was the one who kind of marketed and promoted the Americanized version, and he had been doing a lot of foreign films, and he's the one that came up with the idea that you could dub even serious art house movies. He obviously did a great job of just how to market foreign films in an American audience. And I know nowadays, obviously, I think you agree with me on this, Matt, you'd rather watch a foreign film in its language with a subtitle. But in the 50s, the 60s, you did dub even Fellini, Rossellini, Bergman, films of that nature, and it wasn't considered insulting to them the way we might think of it as insulting now. It was done as a way of saying, hey, this is a good film that's deserving of an American audience, and this will expand the American audience for it and help bring it to our country a little more broadly. And so it was done always, I think, actually with an idea of a respect for a work of art, not as a condescension. Whereas I think now we look at
ironically.
that. Yeah, well, we look at it as very pejorative, but at the time it was not meant that way at all. So I think that release in '56 for this movie is a big part of its success, and it's kind of neat because they even re-edit the structure of it. They have a lot of it in flashback, and So they did kind of some neat stuff when they retooled it for an American experience.
Yeah, I should revisit that one, having just watched the Japanese version. But I do remember seeing it at least a couple times growing up on TV, and it made an impact. But it just always seemed obvious to me that the English-speaking elements were inserted or were added. We probably should mention the music. Akira Ifukube, his score is pretty fantastic here. A lot of those scenes of the military trucks driving with his music really reminded me of Close Encounters. Just brought that to mind for some reason. But very strong original theme. It was also emulated by Michael Giacchino for Cloverfield. That's probably another film to mention that was inspired by this. Even though that movie is obviously very different, being more of a found footage kind of film, but a very influential score here. And you mentioned the music during the underwater sequence at the end. I love that piece, that very somber string piece. Not something you would expect to find at the ending of a film like this.
Well, and the girls singing, the girl choir singing a song for peace.
That too.
Right?
Yeah. That's pretty powerful. All that stuff's pretty emotional, and I think it works really well. And again, not something you would expect to find in something that's sold as more of an action film. So I really think that is a great enhancement to this film for sure.
Well, I also have to say, I think that it's one of those rare films that the main theme, obviously, it's very memorable, very catchy, very powerful. But also, if you're listening to it, you can hear the name of the movie, right? Gojira. You know, that's in the music. If you're listening to it, like you start hearing the tempo of that main theme is telling you the character, the Godzilla, right? Which I guess we just maybe take it aside here. The Godzilla versus Gojira, right? I think every film snob now wants to, look down his nose. Anybody says Godzilla because it's Gojira, right? But I'm not by any means an expert on the Japanese language, but I just was listening to the commentary on this. I just can't remember the name of the gentleman that wrote it. I'm looking it up right now. The commentary is by David Collett, who is a historian and has a history with Japanese cinema. He was talking about how actually the name Godzilla, that spelling, that Americanized version, was what came from Toho in the 50s. It wasn't something that Americans came up with. That's how they transliterated the Japanese into English. And we, of course, mispronounce it because it would be like Godzilla. But I think it just it's a humorous thing that we feel like Americans must have come up with that title and done something stupid. It wasn't an American invention. It came actually from Toho. We just mispronounce the word.
Yeah, I think Godzilla's fine.
Well, Matt, I mean, maybe just we've touched on it, just the sense of legacy. This is obviously I would say this is transcended. I mean, as you said, it's everywhere in Japan, right? Godzilla has become so many different things. Obviously, we're making new movies. I think there's another King Kong versus Godzilla movie that's supposed to come out next year, I believe. So this is obviously something that keeps coming up, and different countries make movies of Godzilla. It's transcended really almost everything. It really is kind of amazing and has influenced any number of different things. You mentioned that you have Cloverfield, the found footage kind of attempt at a Godzilla-esque movie. So you've seen it really hit a lot of things. Would you say that you feel like it's, as a result, that it's lost some of it, the movie now is kind of compromised because of this, or would you say that it actually works better because of that legacy?
Yeah, it's a tough one. I mean, with so many incarnations, it's the character of Godzilla, I think, has been cheapened to a degree over the years and has become a caricature of itself at times. But again, it seems to be a cyclical thing. I think it's interesting to compare this to the James Bond franchise because they both seem to have similar trajectories, right? Where they start out as pretty serious in tone, rooted in a post-war era or an early Cold War era, and then they really pivot toward really over-the-top, goofy action. In James Bond, you have the Roger Moore films kind of being the height of that. And then it starts to pivot back again toward a more serious tone. And I'm not an expert on the Godzilla franchise, so there's probably more undulations in tone and ambition, even throughout that whole era from film to film. But it seems to me there are parallels there. So I do think the character has been watered down, right? Because there are so many incarnations, and may not be as impactful as it could be if there were fewer films. But going back and just visiting this original version, I still think it has quite a bit of power to it. And if you're able to maybe shut out the more goofy incarnations, just like we are able to, I think, with James Bond, and enjoy, the Daniel Craig films for what they are, I think you can do the same with Godzilla. You can kind of pick and choose and watch the versions that resonate the most with you, and still get quite a bit out of it.
You mentioned the trajectory of this and the Bond franchise being similar. I have a theory as to the reason behind that. It's one word: cocaine. If you think about it, right? At the time that both of these franchises really went off the rails, there was a lot of cocaine being done by people in Hollywood and showbiz around the world. So I'm just saying, I wouldn't be surprised if that's part of why they went certain directions in all these different franchises.
It's a hell of a drug, as they say.
It's a fascinating question to me because I've thought about it a lot recently, because there's a lot of movies that you have that great first film, and then they just made sequels of it. You go like, really? You made sequels? Rocky is an example. You got this great film, and then there's like, wait, there's a franchise of Rocky movies. Like, why is there a franchise? If you go back watch the original, why did they do a franchise off of this? And why don't they just leave it alone? And would that movie, the original, stand in even higher esteem if you hadn't kind of almost tainted it by making increasingly ridiculous sequels about this character, right? That almost the character himself becomes larger and bigger than what the original movie was. Jaws is another one where I think that one's managed to survive it. Psycho is another one, right? Where you have this great film and then they kept making just tons of sequels of them. You go, really? Why is there sequels of Psycho, right? So it's fascinating to me about that, because sometimes the sequels work and make the film grow, the original grow, and sometimes they obviously kind of seem to dwarf the original and kind of make it seem cheap as a result. And I think Godzilla, this film obviously very much has a different tone than a lot of what you think of with Godzilla. If you've seen any of the little bits and clips here and there of the films that came out in the 70s and so forth. But I do wonder, to what extent does a movie kind of like this get swallowed up by the franchise that has emerged from its wake, and how would we see this film differently? Could we see it differently if we didn't have all these other films that came after it? Would it maybe have even more power? Would we appreciate the intention a little more for it? I don't know. But I think it's a question that's kind of fascinating to think about. There's no probably way to answer it, but it is worth thinking about.
Yeah, as long as the sequels keep making money, I guess they keep getting made.
Hard to stop.
Probably ultimately what it comes down to.
Hard to stop the gravy train.
Yeah.
Oh.
Well, you mentioned, the pandemic going on currently, obviously. It was interesting to watch this kind of through that lens as well. Of course, Godzilla could be a surrogate for a killer virus or whatever crisis you want to attach to him. And some of the response that was taking place, I couldn't help but notice some parallels there, too.
I remember back during the 2016 election reading an article about someone likening Donald Trump to Godzilla. Just saying that Godzilla's the guy that's going to go and just chomp on those electrical wires. It's like he's just going to do it. And so you kind of, you see this like this force of nature that's unpredictable, uncontrollable. You kind of feel like I can't stop it. No matter what I try to do, it just keeps coming. There's just are ways that you can kind of keep likening it to so many different things. Sometimes silly, like that Donald Trump comparison, but sometimes in a very serious way, like the coronavirus.
Yeah.
Well, maybe just focusing a little bit on the Criterion release. This was released back in 2012 as a single disc for just the original film. I picked it up way back then because I'd never seen the Japanese version, so I'd heard about it, thought, well, let's take a look at it, see how different it is. I was actually a little let down because it seems so much more close to the Americanized version than I had been led to believe based on some of the reviews and the reports. But nonetheless, very handsomely designed package. And then, of course, last year, the big surprise, the number 1,000 spine, was the Godzilla collection, which re-released this film as part of it, as part of those initial Showa-era films. So a very well-done release. I'm really impressed with it. The extras are all pretty informative. There's a lot of interviews, lots of commentaries. The audio commentary that I mentioned by David Callett was just a delight to listen to. To hear somebody who just has so much joy in movies, and in this movie in particular, talk about it. He does a commentary on both versions, the Americanized version as well as the original Japanese. Was just a delight to listen to hear someone who just loves movies like that. So definitely a highly recommended release for anybody who likes this movie. Sounds like, Matt, you probably watched it on the Criterion channel?
Yeah, I think most of the extra features are on there too. The commentary's on there, the original, or I'm sorry, the American version and the original. So it seems pretty comprehensive. And I think all the Showa era films are on Criterion channel as well. So if people want to sample some of those before buying that impressive box set, they can certainly do that.
Yeah, I think they might have held back the King Kong versus Godzilla on the channel. I can't remember. I think they might have held
rights
one
issue there, maybe.
Right. Or a way of trying to entice people to go buy the set.
Yeah, sometimes they don't get the streaming rights. They get the rights to put them on disc, but not necessarily put them on the channel.
Right. So, but no, great release, great cover art. Obviously, the people at Criterion really wanted to. You must have a great love of this movie and of its franchise because they put a lot of work into it in the releases they've made of it. So they obviously have a lot of belief in it.
Must have been a nightmare to get the rights to all those films because they've been notoriously scattered among several different distributors and studios over the years, and lots of different versions of the films. I think one of the criticisms leveled against that box set is that they are missing some of the other Americanized versions of those films, and they only include the Japanese versions. I think they're at the mercy of Toho and what they wanted to release, and it sounds like Toho has been trying to kind of put a lid on some of the Americanized versions of the later Godzilla films. So,
which I suppose that means you got to go hunt down some old VHS copies of them if you can, right?
Yeah, some of them made it to DVD as well, but I think the transfers are notoriously bad on a lot of those titles.
But that's part of the charm of the Americanized versions, isn't it?
Yeah,
I mean,
I think this is a genre where
if I think about a monster movie, I don't necessarily think about it as, and I guess this is partly just because of our age, but I don't think of it as something that's, the absolute most perfect, pristine of condition. I think of it as something I watched on a matinee on TV as a kid growing up, and so to a certain extent, that's the visual image I want, purely from a nostalgia purpose. But there is something about it that you kind of go like, yeah, that feels like that's the right presentation.
Yeah, the aesthetic of VHS or broadcast TV does add to these films sometimes. I mean, I remember seeing, quite a few of the later Godzilla films on TV in that way, and I'm sure they were panned and scanned. And Of course, I'm always a big proponent of original aspect ratio and original versions of films, but yeah, I think you can be forgiven for enjoying the lo-fi presentation for some of these pictures.
Well, Matt, wrapping up our conversation here tonight, what do you think? Does Godzilla belong in the Criterion Collection? Well, maybe
we
actually,
do
hang on.
talk about-
Let me rephrase that question a little bit, because there's kind of, we're talking about just the one film, but there's obviously the two releases. There's the individual release of it, and then there's the box set. So it could be a little difficult question to answer, but does the film itself belong in the collection? And then do you think that the box set belongs in the collection to the extent that you're familiar with it or have a thought about it?
I would definitely say the first film deserves to be in the collection. I mean, it's a landmark film. You can criticize the film directorially or in terms of its visual effects, but it has obviously a very important place in cinema history. I think that's definitely worth including in the collection. So I would say yes. In terms of the collection, the Showa era box, admittedly, I'm just not familiar enough with all the rest of those films to really make a firm determination on that. But some of the later Godzilla films I have seen, they're enjoyable, but is this Criterion Collection level cinema? It's pretty hard to make that argument, I think. I do respect the fact that Criterion seems interested in pursuing some of these more pulpy titles or titles that are more in the collective consciousness of popular culture. The Bruce Lee box set recently being another example of that. But I think it might be a stretch to include that entire run of Godzilla films in the Criterion Collection, as much as the box set is beautiful to look at.
I will say that I did buy the box set, so I have both the original single disc release of it from 2012 as well as the box set, and it is a gorgeous release. It's just meticulously done, so it is a fine release in that regard. You're right. Criterion does seem to have a fondness for getting some of these pulpy and even sort of grindhouse kinds of releases out there. I'm thinking of the Lone Wolf and Cub box set, which I love. Lone Wolf and Cub.
Zatoichi as well.
Yeah, Zatoichi. So I mean, there's a lot of these things, but I don't know that they necessarily all are really truly important films, right? Godzilla, I would say yes, it does belong there. I may think it's overrated, but I don't think it's unimportant. It is obviously an important film. It had a major impact. It shaped a lot of where things went cinematically afterwards. And even if you kind of think the special effects aren't all that great, they were something novel and new, and they did obviously open up possibilities of how some special effects were done going forward. It showed that you could do monster movies without having to do claymation, which is stop motion. And so that was kind of an important actual advancement, I think, in special effects as well. So yes, the first film definitely hands down deserves to be there. Does the box set belong there? Probably not. To be honest, there's a lot of films in there that aren't particularly good, that don't have a major impact. And I think you can separate the original film from the overall legacy of the series. I don't think you have to say, well, it's all part and part. You can think of something like The Godfather and The Godfather Part 2 are so connected with each other that you feel like, well, you bring one, you got to bring the other. This is not that kind of series, and so I think you could say that the collection itself, the Showa era box set, probably it shouldn't be included, but the first film definitely belongs in there.
I do wish Criterion would bring back either their Eclipse line and do Blu-rays.
That would be nice.
That Godzilla set would fit perfectly into something like that. Or even when they used to release other films under the that HVE label that was still associated with Janus films, so we can get kind of some off the beaten path titles that may not necessarily be Criterion level, but could still get some quality treatment. So I would see that Godzilla box more in the vein of an Eclipse set, or something that's neat to have, good to have out there, but not necessarily Criterion level in and of itself.
Yeah, that is something that, I mean, I'm sure it's partly just because the market doesn't support it, but it would be nice if they had some of those offshoots like the Eclipse collection back again. Get some films out there, but they're kind of a little bit of a novelty. They're off on the side. Some neat things you could do there. That wouldn't be bad at all. Well, thank you everybody for joining us tonight as we talk through Godzilla. Please join us next month when we'll be discussing Cold War by Pavel Pawlikowski. Thank you, and keep collecting. Professor Kyoichiro Yamane, played by acclaimed actor Takeshita Shimura. Sorry, that's there was a typo there in my script.
I was going to say.
So I was just autocorrected it for some reason. So I'll try that line again. Hang on.